Why does the world feel more dangerous today? Why are prices spiking and supply chains breaking? It's not just inflation. The global economy is hitting a physical wall. We're running out of cheap water, safe land, and critical minerals. And the race to grab what's left is reshaping everything. If you want to protect your future, you need to understand the new rules. For 70 years, we mapped danger zones by ideology: capitalism versus communism, democracy versus autocracy. We drew lines and called them spheres of influence, but we were looking at the wrong map. The data tells a different story. The Pacific Institute recorded over 2,750 water-related conflicts globally. 2023 saw a record surge. That's not a trend, that's a warning siren. Here's what's changed. The old wars were about whose flag flies over the capital. The new conflicts, they're about whether the ground beneath that capital can still grow food, hold water, or power an economy. Welcome to resource nationalism, where scarcity is a national security crisis, where rivers become weapons, where fishing boats need warship escorts, where the race to save the planet creates new reasons to fight over it. Today, we're walking through three front lines: the drying rivers nations will kill to control, the emptying oceans being militarized, and the hidden war for minerals that power our green future. This isn't fiction. This is happening now. The only question is whether it stays local or goes global. Let's start with the most basic element: water. You've heard water wars thrown around as some far-off threat, but here's what the numbers show. In just 2022 and early 2023, researchers documented 344 water-related conflicts, not over decades, in 18 months. And here's where it gets interesting. Most water conflicts don't look like traditional war. They look like infrastructure attacks, riots when taps run dry. One country quietly choking off flow to its neighbor and calling it water management. Water is weaponized in two ways. First is active, deliberately targeting dams, pipelines, and treatment plants. We've seen this in Ukraine and Gaza. These aren't collateral damage. These are strategic choices. The second way is passive and more dangerous. Upstream nations restricting flow, building massive dams without consulting downstream countries, slowly turning off the tap and daring someone to stop them. A 2024 UN report makes this clear. Water scarcity is now a primary driver of instability, and that instability doesn't stay contained. It bleeds into global supply chains. It triggers food price spikes. It creates migration waves that destabilize regions thousands of miles away. Here's a concrete example. In North Africa and the Middle East, governments have fallen not just because of corruption, but because the faucets went dry. When people can't drink, can't wash, can't water crops, political legitimacy evaporates faster than the water itself. But while local water riots are terrifying, there's one specific river where scarcity could trigger an actual state-on-state war, and that's where we need to go next. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. If you haven't heard of it, you need to, because it might be the prototype for every 21st century resource conflict. Here's the setup. Egypt relies on the Nile for 97% of its renewable water. That's not dependency, that's an umbilical cord. Egyptian officials call the Nile a matter of existence, not prosperity, existence. The Nile's water mostly comes from Ethiopia, and Ethiopia, one of the poorest countries on earth, built Africa's largest hydroelectric dam on that river. Its purpose? Generate electricity for tens of millions of Ethiopians living without power, to lift the country out of energy poverty, to control its own development. So Egypt says, this river is our survival, and Ethiopia says, this dam is our sovereignty. Both are right. That's the paradox. Here's where it gets complicated. Colonial-era treaties from the 1920s and 1950s gave most Nile water to Egypt and Sudan. Ethiopia's position is simple. We didn't sign those treaties, we're not bound by them. Egypt's position is equally simple. International agreements matter, and unilateral action is aggression. The dam is already built. It's filling. And every time Ethiopia releases, or doesn't release, water, tensions spike. In 2024 and 2025, accusations flew that Ethiopia's dam management worsened flooding downstream. Ethiopia denied it. Egypt didn't believe them. Diplomacy has stalled. The African Union tried to mediate. The US tried to broker a deal. Nothing stuck, because this isn't a technical problem. It's a zero-sum resource trap where one country's electricity is another's existential threat. Here's the belief-breaking part. Green energy can cause war. We assume renewable energy brings peace, right? But in the Nile Basin, the quest for clean energy is the primary driver of potential military conflict. Egypt has hinted it reserves all options to protect its water security. That's diplomatic code. Ethiopia said it will defend the dam. That's not ambiguous either. This is the future of resource conflict, not ideology, not territory, but the physical elements that keep a nation alive. If the Nile shows us the danger of rivers, the South China Sea shows us what happens when the resource is mobile, vanishing, and surrounded by nuclear powers. When you hear South China Sea, you probably think warships and artificial islands. That's all real. But here's what headlines miss. The immediate crisis isn't oil or trade routes, it's fish. The South China Sea is critical. 1/3 of global maritime trade passes through it. But for 270 million people along its coasts, it's something simpler. It's the grocery store, or it used to be. Fish stocks have collapsed to 5 to 30% of 1950s levels. We've wiped out 70 to 95% of the fish in one human lifetime. Why? Overfishing, industrial trawlers, climate change, and a vicious cycle where each country races to grab what's left before their neighbor does. So what do you do when the ocean is running out and your coastal communities depend on it? You militarize the fishing fleet. China, Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia, they've all deployed maritime militias. These are civilian fishing boats coordinated by the state, often manned by retired military, backed by Coast Guard vessels. They're not just fishing, they're asserting presence, pushing rivals out, turning the search for dinner into geopolitical chess. We've seen Coast Guard ships use water cannons on fishing boats, nets cut, boats rammed, crews detained, and hovering in the background, sometimes not even in the background, are actual warships. Here's the insight. Modern navies are guarding food trucks. We think of this as a struggle for trade routes and energy, and it is. But for people living there, it's literally a fight for survival. The tragedy? This is a problem everyone shares and no one can solve alone. Overfishing doesn't respect borders. A collapsed ecosystem hurts everyone. But cooperation requires trust, and trust requires giving up short-term advantage. When your fishing communities are starving now, long-term sustainability is a luxury you can't afford. We're running out of water, we're running out of food. But here's the irony. The technology we're building to save the planet is creating a new shortage that might be just as dangerous. Let's talk about what nobody wants to admit. Going green might make resource wars worse. Here's why. The transition to net zero requires a massive increase in mining. We're talking 6-fold increase in demand for critical minerals by 2030, from 4.7 million tons in 2022 to roughly 30 million tons by decade's end. Lithium, cobalt, nickel, rare earths. These aren't luxury goods. They're the foundation of the energy transition. No minerals, no batteries. No batteries, no green economy. Here's where geopolitics gets dangerous. These minerals aren't evenly distributed. Africa holds 56% of the world's cobalt, 54% of manganese, and 92% of platinum group metals. South America's lithium triangle controls much of the world's lithium. China dominates rare earth processing. And the United States. In 2024, the US extracted only 2% of global lithium and under 1% of global nickel and cobalt. America, and Europe, is almost entirely dependent on imports for materials that power the future. So what happens when supplier countries realize they hold all the cards? You get resource nationalism. We're already seeing it. Governments are tightening export controls, demanding raw minerals be processed domestically, renegotiating contracts, raising royalties, in some cases just nationalizing mines outright. Indonesia banned nickel ore exports. Zimbabwe is restricting lithium. The Congo is pushing for more local value add. China has hinted at restricting rare earth exports as geopolitical leverage. This is the new sanctions regime. Forget cutting off oil. The real power is cutting off minerals that make decarbonization possible. Here's the belief-breaking part. Decarbonization doesn't mean deconfliction. Moving away from oil doesn't end resource wars. It just shifts the front line from the Persian Gulf to cobalt mines in Congo and lithium flats in Bolivia. The scramble is underway. The US is pouring subsidies into domestic mining. Europe is securing long-term contracts. China is locking up supply through belt and road investments. It's the great game all over again, except instead of oil fields, it's battery factories and mineral concessions. As the equator heats up and resources dry out, major powers are looking to one place that's actually opening up because of climate change. And that's where we go next. Climate change is usually framed as universal disaster, and for most of the world it is. But for a few countries, Russia, Canada, and China, a melting Arctic is a strategic asset. Here's what's happening. As Arctic ice retreats, two things become accessible: shorter shipping routes and untapped resources. The Northern Sea route along Russia's Arctic coast can cut shipping time between Europe and Asia by 40% compared to the Suez Canal. That's not minor. That's a complete reshaping of global trade. And Russia is asserting it controls this route, that ships need Russian permission and icebreaker escorts. They're turning a melting ocean into a toll booth. Then there are resources. The Arctic holds an estimated 13% of the world's undiscovered oil, 30% of undiscovered natural gas, and significant rare earth deposits. For decades, these were locked under ice. Now, they're becoming accessible. The response? Militarization. Russia has reopened Soviet-era Arctic bases and built new ones. It's deployed air defense systems, stationed troops, and expanded its icebreaker fleet, the world's largest. Canada and the US are scrambling to catch up. China, despite not being an Arctic nation, declared itself a near-Arctic state and is investing heavily in icebreakers and Arctic research. Why? Because if the Northern Sea route becomes a major trade artery, China wants a say in who controls it. Here's the insight. Climate change has beneficiaries. We assume all nations want to stop the ice from melting. But geopolitically, some nations are quietly preparing to profit from a warmer Arctic. They're not saying it out loud, but the infrastructure investments tell the story. This is a slow burn conflict. There's no shooting war in the Arctic, yet, but pieces are being positioned. Territorial claims are being staked. Military presence is being normalized. And all of these conflicts, water, food, minerals, ice, eventually lead to the same outcome. People can no longer stay where they are. Let's connect the dots. When rivers dry up, crops fail. When oceans empty, coastal communities lose their food. When land degrades, it stops supporting people. And when that happens, people move. Not because they want to, because they have to. This is migration as physics, not politics. The 2024 Ecological Threat Report lays it out. 50 countries, home to 1.3 billion people, face high or very high ecological threats. Water scarcity, land degradation, food insecurity, and populations in these regions are projected to grow 51% by 2050. Do the math. More people, less water, less land. The equation doesn't balance. Something has to give. And what gives is stability. Here's how it works. Drought hits. Crops fail. Farmers move to cities looking for work. Cities can't absorb them. Unemployment spikes. Food prices rise. Social services collapse. Protests start. Governments crack down. The cycle accelerates. And here's what rich countries don't want to hear. You can't legislate away a drought. You can build walls, pass stricter laws. deploy border patrols. But none of that changes the fact that the land those people are leaving can no longer support them. The migration is a symptom, the resource deficit is the disease. We've seen this pattern. The Syrian civil war was preceded by the worst drought in the country's modern history. Farmers abandoned land. Rural to urban migration spiked. The government failed to respond. And the rest is history. Sub-Saharan Africa is facing a similar trajectory. Without massive investment in water infrastructure and sustainable agriculture, we're looking at tens of millions of climate refugees in coming decades. And those refugees won't stay in the region. They'll move toward Europe, the Middle East, anywhere that looks stable. And receiving countries will frame it as an invasion, not a consequence of ecological collapse they helped cause. Here's the point. Migration crises are resource crises. The political debate focuses on borders, sovereignty, culture. But those are downstream arguments. Upstream, the real issue is that entire regions are becoming uninhabitable. So what happens when 1.3 billion people live in zones that can't sustain them and the rich world has locked the doors? You get resource nationalism on steroids. You get countries hoarding water, food, and minerals. You get walls, and you get conflicts. Not necessarily wars between states, but constant, grinding instability that never resolves. This is the endgame of unchecked resource scarcity. Not a single apocalyptic war, but a world of permanent crisis, where the gap between zones of depletion and zones of abundance becomes the defining fault line of the 21st century. So the question becomes, is this inevitable? Or is there another path? The news tells you we're falling apart, but the data shows we're just changing. Yes, resources are tight, but human creativity is unlimited. We can turn this resource war into a resource revolution. It starts with understanding the problem. If you agree we need more solutions and less panic, hit the like button so this message reaches more people. The future belongs to the builders, not the battles.